My name is Ron Brophy. I am here to introduce the speakers for this panel discussion. As a New Hampshire Liberty Alliance endorsed Republican candidate for state rep in 2014, I came less than 200 votes short of unseating an incumbent Democrat in a blue-leaning district of South Nashua. With the help of the organization directed by our following speakers, you could achieve all of this and more. Now, without further ado, our speakers for the How We Kick Legislative Butt panel. Dan McGuire served 3 terms in the legislature where he helped develop the state budget. He is the vice chair of the Merrimack County Republicans, the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance's political director, and the Granite State Taxpayers Secretary. But most importantly, Dan and his bridge partner are the current New Hampshire State New Hampshire State champions. Let's hear it for Dan. Jeff Cream is research director and life member of the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance. Jeff has exerted at least a little effort toward the creation of a society in which the maximum role of government is the protection of individuals' rights to life, liberty, and property. But he regularly falls short of achieving the fullest practical effort. Thank you very much for that, Jeff. He is also the current organizer of the National Liberty Social Events. And finally, we have Steve Valet. Unlike many liberty-leaning people, he's not politically active in the usual sense. He has serious doubts about the standard libertarian tenet that private charity would be enough to take care of all legitimately needy people, a topic he has discussed in detail during a short talk he gave at Liberty Forum 2014 and in a longer Alt Expo talk he gave at Liberty Forum 2015. Steve is a software engineer as well as treasurer of the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, and he will now be escorted out of the room. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. So I see a few former NHLA board members in this room, including my wife. So the NHLA is an organization that was founded in 2003, way before any of us were involved. And it's been growing and building ever since. I think we're up to close to 600 members, maybe, something like that. And what we do is we work to influence the legislature and the state in a liberty-oriented direction. And we have many, many different kinds of activities. Some specific, most of them are specifically political, but we also do some more social sort of things as well. My particular job on the NHLA, I'm the political director, and it's my job to interface with the legislature, so personally. So I go and testify in front of committees on legislation. So every week, I look through the calendar for that week, find out what bills, both good and bad, are being proposed, what are most important, what things I have time to go to, what I could think I might have some influence talking to the committee, and then I go and testify in front of the committee. And the key to testifying in a committee is not to talk too long. In particular, there was a hearing recently. I went on the it was a school bill related to homeschooling, and I spoke for 2 sentences. And I had people come up afterwards and say, "Wow, what a great speech that." And one of the sentences was a joke, so it was, anyways. So the key is you speak as briefly as you can to get your point across, and ideally get as many people to testify as possible. So this is something we and I in particular can use a lot of help on. If you are somebody who has sometime during the day, Tuesday through Thursday, and can make it to Concord on occasion, please come and see me afterwards, and we can talk about what kind of things you're interested in, what subjects, because the legislature, unfortunately, has their fingers in everything. And so we'd like to get you to come and testify in front of committees. It's especially useful if it's something you know of from your work, from your home, from your whatever social activity. Things that you know personally can be very, very effective. So Anyways, we'll talk more later, but I'll pass it off to Jeff here.
Thank you. So, the title of the talk, and I think this is Dan's idea, right? How we kick legislative butt. And I was thinking about that, last night. And so I'm going to say something bold. Here's how we do it. We don't. And, what we can actually do is we can sort of nudge legislative butt, but what we really need in order to actually kick legislative butt is actually people in the room and people who are not in the room to do things like show up and testify or run for office. Even if you don't win, you can get some liberty ideas out there, but what's even better? Winning. So actually go ahead and run and actually win, because in the end, we'll talk a little bit about what we do. We're really making differences on the margins. We can basically, push something one way or another and maybe make a little bit of difference, but in the end, it's the votes that count, it's numbers that count, and there's very little that can be done if we basically don't stay involved. And when there's a loss for liberty, some vote goes away, I don't want it to go. I do feel like it's my fault, but we should all feel like it's all of our fault, because people can, whether you're from the state originally, or you're basically thinking about moving, or you've already moved and signed a statement of intent, think about what that said. It actually takes a little bit of effort to actually get the world you want to live in. So, having said that, I do think we do a little bit of good things. I'm currently the research director, so what does that position entail? So there's actually a couple things that we do. So we have a system called the bill review system. That's another way that people can help with pretty much very low impact to your lives. So what we do is we have some training and a electronic web-based system where you can go in, you can review legislation and say, oh boy, this is a big stinker bill, it's going to be a problem, and you basically rate it on a couple different categories. And the very first thing that does is kind of helps to sort of raise the visibility of some bad bills, or maybe hopefully some good bills that could use some help. And so in my role, one of the things I do is I have oversight over the bill review system, not the implementation of it so much as the, is that a good bill review, and trying to get people to actually to help. I do the bill review training as well. So once we go about and do bill reviews, what ends up eventually happening after Dan goes and testifies, eventually bills make it to the House or the Senate floor for votes. And so the next thing we do is we create something we call the gold standard, and I'm sure you can all read that from here. But this is basically a document we produce pretty much every week when the House and Senate are in session, and it goes through each bill that they're going to vote on. It sort of gives them a short summary of what it is the bill does, whether it's pro-liberty or anti-liberty, and a few bullet points that say why you should vote for it or against it. And so we pull data out of the bill review system for that. We also do some analysis of our own and pull that document together and get it out every week, and it gets handed out to the State House. And so you wonder, sometimes is it having an effect? Is anyone actually paying attention to it? And it's really hard to get a metric. We have no counterfactual. What would happen that week if there was no gold standard? But one way I kind of feel like we must be having some impact is when the Speaker of the House looks at it and goes, I don't like that. Or they call it out on the House floor and say, that's wrong, you shouldn't do that. Well, that means that at least our political enemies think we're having an impact, so we're probably having some impact. And so, there's lots of reasons we're doing this. We're creating these voting guides because we're trying to basically influence people to vote the way we want them to vote, but they won't always vote that way. And so next thing we do is we record those votes when we get roll calls. And we come up with a liberty rating. So at the end of each session, basically end of the legislative year, we tally up the votes, who voted the right way, and what's was this a high impact bill or a low impact bill? And we create something called the liberty rating, which goes through, basically gives every legislator a scorecard, an A through F. And I will say we definitely grade on the curve. If you were to look at the grades that you actually get to get a C, it's a pretty low score. So the A pluses are great, the A's are really good, and it starts falling off pretty quickly after that, because basically what you don't want to do is give 10 legislators A's and everybody else gets a D, and they feel like, well, why do I even want to bother? So it's a little bit of a balancing game here to try to basically keep people in the margins and keeping them sucked in and making them feel like they're actually part of the game. So one reason I mentioned that is you'll kind of go through, you'll see somebody who's a C, and you'll look at their votes and you're like, oh my gosh, they voted pretty poorly. Well, don't worry, there's people who got Fs, and there's people who got worse than an F. They get a constitutional threat, and most of the time, my particular state reps are in that constitutional threat category. And so, we publish this, when incumbents run again for re-election, those scores are available. We use that for our endorsement process, which is actually something the board and Dan works together based upon this. And it's not even just us who uses the data. So right before this talk, in another room, there was another PAC that is involved in getting candidates and doing endorsements, and they use the data. We publish this freely for people to share, and so other groups in the state use the same data that we're using, and actually we'll list things like, well, did the NHLA give them a good score? Did a Business Industry Alliance give them a good score? Did the House Republican Alliance give them a good score? Or any of the other agencies that go about and do scores. So we're one of a few groups in the state who basically have a broad-based scorecard down across all the issues. And yes, I think that's good. I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, I'm Steve Millay, and I'm the treasurer. That involves obviously keeping the bank books, but also, since this is a political organization, I need to file reports with the Secretary of State, listing anybody who donated more than a threshold amount, and so on. So that's a little bit of work, but I enjoy doing that. One of the most important things the NHLA does is make direct contributions to campaigns. We're strictly nonpartisan, so anyone who is a liberty-oriented candidate based on our objective criteria. In the case of incumbents, it's based on roll call votes. In the case of newbies, it's based on how they scored on our candidate survey. If you got above a certain threshold, then you get a contribution from us. And in 2016, we donated, I believe it was over $30,000 total to various liberty-oriented campaigns, and we hope to do even better this year. And if you'd like to help out with that and make a donation, you can see me afterward, or just go to our website and go to the donate button. We'd really appreciate it. That's
actually, I have one more thing to say. So actually, when we were looking at donations, right? So that number he said, $30,000, right? So it's, it doesn't sound like a lot. We're used to hearing about, presidential campaigns and things where people spend, $1 billion or hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a pretty big amount of money in the state. If we could get that 30,000, like up to like 50,000 or 70,000, we would be, competing at the levels of like the state parties and having influence. And although we might not want money to have influence in elections or in our lives, it does, right? So we definitely already are having influence with the amount of money that we give, but if we could basically just up it a little bit more, we would be sort of at the level where we could really be making a difference.
Yeah, politics is a numbers game, and the numbers are very favorable to us in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is about the size, a fifth of the average state size, something like that, all right? So we have a little less than 0.5% of all the people in the country live in New Hampshire. And our legislature is the biggest by a factor of 2. So we have 424 legislators, 400 in the House. The next biggest is Pennsylvania, and they have like 208, I think, something like that. So they're half our size and a much bigger state. So a little bit, it's extremely easy for a person to get into the legislature, but once you're there, it's all a numbers game, right? So to win, you need 50% plus 1 on any given topic. And if you're somewhere in the middle on certain topics, then your influence is multiplied, right? Because if you're somewhere between what the typical Democrat's going to vote for and what the typical Republican's going to vote for, you're in the 30, 40 people who make a decision on that subject. The downside of having such a large legislature is that there is a ton of legislation proposed every year, right? This is essentially, the other great thing about our legislature is it's non-professional. So people aren't paid to be there, they're paid a nominal $100 in mileage. But it's really a hobby for the members of the legislature. It is not a job. And so therefore, people are interested in not what really gets them elected. They're interested in stuff that interests them. It's their hobby. So the things that they find interesting, that they find fun, both for good and for bad, right? So just as there's people on our side are pro-liberty, there's plenty of anti-liberty people that they think that's interesting and fun. And so every year there's 800,000 bills, something like that, right? So from 400 legislators, you know, everyone on average is putting in two bills, and you know, some put in none, some put in 40, you know, so it's like, and so there's a lot of work, and so things like what Jeff's organization does to read all the bills, rate all the bills, and distill them is a huge benefit, not just to us as activists, but also to legislators. And so it's something, it becomes a resource for them on how to, on what things to watch out for and what things to pay attention to. Because it's a tremendous, just even reading all that legislation is next to impossible. I mean, I knew one legislator who actually did it, you know, before every session he would actually read all actual bills, and it's really, nobody does that except this guy, Mike Kapler, I know did it. But and the other thing about having lots of legislators, lots of bills, is you're constantly fighting the same battles over and over again, right? Because just because you won 2 years ago with that legislature, well, there's always somebody on the other side, and they can come back the next 2 years and put in the opposite, right? So for example, this year, so we had one of our best years, my first year in the legislature was 2011, 2012, when we had Bill O'Brien was the speaker, and it was liberty-oriented people that made Bill O'Brien the speaker. I can say that for absolute fact, because in the Republican caucus where that decision was being made as to who was going to be the speaker, I could count at least 10 other Free Staters in the room, right? People who thought the way I did, and Carol and so on. And he won versus Gene Chandler in the room by, I think it was 5 votes, 6 votes, something like that, right? And we had all voted for him. So if we weren't in that room, Gene Chandler would have been the speaker at the time. It would have been a huge difference in who were the committee chairs, what legislation got passed, all that sort of stuff. And in particular, I'll talk about one particular bill. One thing that legislature did was deregulate homeschoolers, right? So homeschoolers were forced at the time to put in a lot of reports and have interaction with their local school principals and all this sort of stuff. And so a bill went through that basically said you inform the school that you're taking your kid out and homeschooling them, and that's the end until you know, if you want to put them back in school, then you can go inform them of that. But it really, you're still required to do work and keep records and all that sort of stuff locally, because there's still truancy laws. But the point is, there wasn't, it cut the cord in a lot of regulation on homeschools, made it much easier. And so this year, there's a bill in to undo that, right? So this year, there's a bill in from a Democrat that says, you know, we want to re-regulate, you know, and make sure that people don't fall through the cracks and all this sort of stuff. And what really, what helped show me that we're having influence is, or our side, I guess, you know, it's not just the NHLA, it's our side, is that hearing for that bill was in Reps Hall, okay? Reps Hall is the room where 400 people have a chair to sit in, okay? There's one room in the State House like that. Standard committee rooms can seat 20, 25 people in the committee and another 25 people in the audience. But this room is 400 people, the committee talking with 400 people in the audience, right? Because anybody can come and testify. That's why I want you to come help me, is to go to testify in front of committees. But so this particular bill that would re-regulate homeschooling was forced to be held in Reps Hall because the room is packed with mothers and children who are homeschoolers, right? Who don't want this bill, okay? And it's the kind of thing that not too long ago would only happen when the other side is packing such a bill with their people, right? A typical bill that the other side comes in on is something deregulating hairdressers. Okay, so we have one bad thing about New Hampshire. We have a ton of occupational licensing. So many ridiculous small professions. One of the worst I can think of is sports agents. So there's like 6 licensed sports agents in New Hampshire, and because, in some sense, because it's so easy to put in legislation, you can put in stuff, little tiny stuff like that. Anyways, so anytime it turns out there are 30,000 licensed hairdressers in New Hampshire, okay? So 30,000 is a number much greater than 400. And a lot of them are women with children. So anytime you want to deregulate hairdressers even a little bit, right? So it takes, I don't know, it's 1,500 hours or something worth of schooling to become a hairdresser. And if you want to say, let's make that 1,000, right? Which is what their professional national organization recommends, right? So if you put in a bill like that, they can fill the room with mothers and children, no matter how big a room you decide, to oppose it. And so anyways, so this bill on homeschooling was the opposite, and it's one of the first times I've seen our side fill Reps Hall with a group of people like that, and it was fantastic. And so I don't even have to talk in a room like that, right? That bill is going nowhere, because when you have that kind of outpouring of people against a bill, it's so easy to vote no on something that constituents don't like, people don't like. All right. By the way, for questions, feel free to come up to the microphone anytime. So we were required to, so you're on the recording. That's the microphone right there. So if you have a question, just walk up to it. That'll influence us to take a break. So, Jeff, I wanted to ask you to talk about how do you decide what goes in the gold standard?
Well, that's an interesting question. Right, so one of the first things we do when the gold standard comes out is I just do a quick read through the bills that are going to come up for vote. And if it's the House, there's often a little committee blurb about why the committee came to what they thought they were going to come to. So I usually read that first. I then usually go into the bill review system and take a look at, to see what the bill reviewers have thought about it. And everyone who's doing bill reviews is a volunteer, right? And everybody's got a different level of skill. So sometimes a bill reviewer will be completely wrong, and actually that still can be helpful because I can still see where they were coming from, why they were coming from it. So I'm basically going through and looking for bills that are relatively high impact, things where we can make a difference. I will, having said that, I have definitely thrown things on the gold standard that maybe are not high impact, but they're definitely bills that are, even if it's going to be a little bit anti-liberty, if I think we can actually, maybe make a difference, I'll put it in there. We also have a couple of issues, actually, I guess we're down to one formal issue of a do not touch issue, and those are issues where there's some consensus, at least, that within the libertarian community or within liberty as a whole, that there are multiple valid arguments for something. So things on a do not touch list, we basically don't include. So that the only real one that's kind of left in there right now is abortion. So regardless of how one may feel one way or another, we just don't take a position on that. So we just stay silent on it. So basically, a bill that's going to do something like name a bridge and it's not going to spend any money. I'm not going to put that on there. We used to not really put on study commissions, so that the legislature will sometimes start up a study commission to go think about something for a while and spend a year, and the bills themselves are pretty low impact, so we used to sort of ignore them because they're kind of small. But then you start noticing hey, there's a study commission to see what's the best way to destroy people's liberty, and they're going to come up with recommendations and come up with a bill. So a commission that looks pretty generic or just studying something, that won't go on there. But in the last couple of years, we've started actually putting study committees on there if they are sort of stacked against us in terms of what they're going to recommend, or if the whole thing they're studying is something that well, no, you shouldn't be doing that. And of course, most of the time the answer is no, you shouldn't be doing that. So then, the next thing is, we kind of go through, and I have, there's a good number of volunteers who help with the gold standard, and so there's certain people who are very good on certain topics. So we have an education liaison, Michelle Lavelle, who probably just behind me here in the room. who really follows the education bills very, very closely. And often we can look at a bill and we can, we can know if it's pro-liberty, anti-liberty, but there's sometimes you look at them and you're not really sure what it might do, and it's really good to have somebody who's following very closely to, look at the legislation, figure out where it came from, what's the current situation, to decide if it's really making something better or worse. And a good example, this actually hasn't shown up in the gold standard yet, because it hasn't been to a floor vote. But there's a bill, SB 353. And the summary sounds actually pretty good. It says, this bill removes the requirement for alcohol retailers to apply for a direct shipper permit. Like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. You know what? Who wants to make people have a permit? Okay, so let me read the bill, because sometimes that summary can be a little bit misleading. Okay, so all it really does is, boy, it just crosses out retailer from the list. Wow, this is a great bill. It's going to get rid of a requirement for retailers to get the shipping permit. So then, and when if this gets to the point where it shows up on for a floor vote, you go and listen to committee testimony, and you find out, oh well, there's another part of the law that says you can't ship if you don't have this permit. So what's actually going on here is this is actually a protectionist bill that was requested by the Liquor Commission to say, we don't want retailers in other states to be able to ship to New Hampshire. Now that's something to allow other people like winemakers and manufacturers to ship here, but we don't want retailers in other states to do it because that's going to hurt our business. And heck, we're only one of 8 states that allow it or something like that. So we definitely shouldn't allow it. And then shortly afterwards, the New Hampshire Retailer Association comes up and goes, yeah, that's right, we don't want this either. But can you clarify to make sure we can still ship stuff to other states? And one of the senators on is like, so wait, you're saying you want to make sure other states can't ship here, but you're very concerned that you can still ship to them, right? And those are the kind of things that come up. So occasionally it's nice to have an expert, because you can look at a bill, it can look, it can even look pro-liberty, and you can find out it's not. But I would say that, for anyone who's thinking about getting into bill reviewing, don't freak out by that. That's like maybe, you get a couple of those a year. Most of them are very obvious what's going to happen.
So we can talk about how legislation is written. So every bit of legislation has been voted on by our legislature is essentially been written by attorneys that are hired by the state to do this sort of thing, but they're all approved by that group of 400 legislators. So for the most part, it's legible. It's something you can read and understand. The real issue is when something that Jeff just brought up is you have to understand an entire chapter, sort of, all the things dealing with liquor retailing, right? In order to know that just changing this one section, there's other sections that apply. That's the hard part. But in general, it's not that hard to actually read a sentence and understand what that sentence does, because, again, we have a non-professional legislature, and they had to do it. There are certain sections of the law that are impenetrable legalese, and those tend to be things that are promulgated across the entire United States by certain organizations that kind of control that area. And the thing I'm thinking about in particular is the Uniform Commercial Code. So there's essentially sort of business law that is not federal law, but it's been adopted by every state, including ours. And it's something like 100 pages long of gobbledygook. So changes to that law tend to be, well, this year we've got these 40 pages or something like that, and you can argue whether it's a good idea or not, because it does make the legalities of commerce the same all through the country, so that helps with cross-border things and things like that, but it doesn't help that it's very, very hard to read and understand. You need to be an expert. But for most kinds of bills, the stuff, the kind of education bills, all that sort of stuff, it's things that are readable and understandable. I guess we should talk a little bit about our successes, or our, I want to sort of follow up, a number of you may have been in the session just now with Marav, and they talked about things that have worked in our, over the years in our legislature. One sort of measure of our success, I think, is the Liberty rating. So every summer, we have an event called the Liberty Dinner, where we hand out awards to the best legislators. And over the years, the rating given to those award winners has been increasing, and the number of award winners has been increasing. So I kind of think that things are on the right track. I think a couple of years ago we had just one person who had a perfect score, and then we had a few more who have a perfect score, and this last time, what do we have, 9? Nine legislatures, right, who had absolutely a perfect score. What's that, 2.5% or something of the legislature? So we want that trend to continue, right? More and more people with a perfect score. And I even think, you know, the overall set of scores is improving, right? It's not just those are the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of the discussion in the legislature, you know, it used to be when you come in and give a liberty argument, this was like, you know, what's that? That's not interesting, right? You know, there's a difference between just like being a fiscal conservative and being a small government person, right? And being in favor of liberty. Because sometimes maybe liberty costs a little more, but it's worth it, right? So, you know, maybe you can't do something quite so efficiently or whatever, but if you let people have a little more freedom, it's worth doing. And even if it's, I guess even if it's, you can think of things where it's more trouble for the bureaucracy, right? So, you know, well, if I gave people all that information for free, right, it's going to cost, but there's things that are worth doing anyways. So it used to be we'd make those kind of arguments and it'd be a weird argument. But a lot of the discussion has sort of moved on our turf, right? The other side now knows this is an issue that they need to talk about, and they try to couch their arguments in our language, which is somewhat of a game. Yes, Rich.
Thank you. First of all, could you talk about how bills that, I think I meant to ask, are only bills that make it to the full House voted on? And I mean, not voted on, but rated by the NHLA. And the other question related to that is, what happens if a bill isn't taken off the consent calendar and whatever? For those who don't know what it means, votes with a lump of bills, are they rated, and if so, how are they rated? And please, with all due respect, Jeff, could you speak a little more slowly? I can hear the volume, but it's a little hard.
Okay, I'll take the first half of that question about the procedures in the legislature, and then I can give Jeff to talk about what we do as an organization on those bills, okay? So, just to make it clear to everybody, because I'm sure people who haven't been in the legislature, it's sort of obscure. One of the other, I really think we have the best legislature, bar none, in the country. There's no question about it. But one of the great things is it is not possible for a committee to stifle a bill, okay? They can do it for 1 year out of the 2. The first year they can put it off, but they can't put it off completely. The entire legislature votes on every single bill that's proposed, okay? That's not true in many, many other states. And I don't think it's true in Congress, actually, but I don't know that for sure. So every bill has a hearing before the entire body. There is a somewhat of a caveat to that, but it's not much, which is just for efficiency reasons, if there's a bill that everybody on the committee essentially agrees one way or the other, it could be, most of the time it's to defeat the bill, but sometimes it's to pass the bill or to pass the bill with some changes, they can say, okay, we all agree on this, we'll put this on what they call the consent calendar. And the consent calendar is voted on by the legislature in one vote. So it's a way of dealing with 50 non-controversial decisions all in one vote. So it saves time for the legislature. But if any single individual legislator wants to argue something on the consent calendar. So the consent calendar is not going the way they want. They're defeating something they like, or they're passing something they don't like. They can remove it from the consent calendar, make it a regular bill, and it'll have a regular discussion and so on in front of the entire body. It's one of the highlights of my legislative career was when I pulled something from the consent calendar and got it overturned. Okay? Very, very rare, and it was only possible when I'm a Republican, when my party had a super majority. We had almost 3/4 of the people in the room. So I had more influence than I would normally. But one year I was able to do that, and that was a real it was a real thrill. But anyways, it was mostly because it was a bad committee and they hadn't noticed some details of this bill and so on. But so that's the point, is that there are no bottled up bills in that sense, like there can be in other states. All right, so now let's talk, Jeff can talk about what we do on every.
Right, so the first thing is that there's a couple different ways that bills are rated, so just with respect to that. So bill review is happening sort of independent of what's going on with the calendar. So volunteers are going in, some of them in the audience, thank you. And they're basically reviewing bills that are coming up for committee votes or just bills that look interesting to them. So those are all getting looked at to some extent, I guess I would say, and a score has come up with them. But that score doesn't go anywhere unless it ends up on the gold standard. And so now what happens if a bill ends up on the consent calendar, if members of the Gold Standard Committee believe there's something on there that we want to try to get somebody on the record for, voting for it or against it, then we will sometimes participate and work with a couple of friendly reps to have things pulled off consent. I would say it's pretty rare though. I mean, I think things definitely get pulled off consent, and usually a friendly rep who's going to pull something off consent will send me a message saying, hey, I'm pulling this off. But most of the time, even when they pull them off, they're not bills that are going on the gold standard for one reason or another. That doesn't mean they're not important, but I guess one thing I left off is that a bill that is doing something like pretty good, but is also expanding the bureaucracy and adding more laws. That it's kind of a fuzzy area now. It's like, hey, it's pretty good, but it's also making government bigger. A lot of those don't end up on the gold standard, and a couple times I've seen things pull off consent that it wasn't a good enough bill to actually put on the gold standard.
Well, part of the reason I ask is, personally, I tend to pitch things more often than the average person at my reps. I'll mention names. Kim Rice introduced a bill on my behalf. She did her thing, and I went up to speak on it. It was unanimously ITL'd by the committee, which I didn't fully understand, but it happened. And then I asked Representative Dyer, took the bill off consent, and then the legislature subsequently tabled the bill. Okay? And perhaps I should know this, but what is that voted on to table as a whole, or is the speaker just decide we're going to table that bill? And
It's the whole body. Okay, the speaker is just the leader of the meeting. Okay, the speaker is not making any decisions unless the whole body is split down the middle. Any personal decisions of that sort. So when your bill was tabled, it was the whole body voting to do it. Now they can do it by voice vote. So there are 3 ways to vote. Okay, they can vote by voice vote. They can vote where the numbers, they push a button and they count the numbers. That's called a division vote, but it's not printed as to who did what, okay? So it's just a total, 250 one way, 150 the other way, okay? Or you can have a recorded roll call vote where at the end of the day it'll be published, I voted this way, he voted that way, she voted that way, like that, okay? Now, it is up to the body which one of those 3 types of votes occurs on any given question, including a decision to table a bill. So, if the default on any vote is a voice vote, so if it's not close, nobody thinks it's going to be a big deal, they don't want to waste time, the speaker will say, "Are you ready for the question?" And if nobody says anything, it's going to be a voice vote, okay? And then, all those in favor say aye, aye. All those in favor say nay, nay. The ayes have it, gavel down, okay? So it's the speaker, essentially you're telling the speaker, you call it when on a voice vote, and typically it's not close, okay? The speaker, if he's not sure, can say, well, I'm not sure, let's count the numbers, okay? Because sometimes one side or the other is particularly noisy. Okay, now, just when the speaker says, are you ready for the question, somebody can stand up and say, division, all right? And when they
press the button.
And that means everybody's going to press the button, okay? And so then you'll know 300 were this way and 100 were that way, okay? You won't know who. Or somebody can stand up and say, roll call, and I want to know who, okay? That motion to have a roll call has to be seconded by 10 people. So the speaker will say, is that sufficiently seconded? And 10 people have to stand up. Now usually, whoever asks for the roll call, they have at least 10 friends in the room. So, it's a formality, but you'll get a roll call. But it's up to the body, whatever happens. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I guess we're in Q&A period. Alvin.
I'll follow up on his question. Once the bill's on the table, what happens?
Okay, good. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it turns out sometimes you can imagine with 400 people, and there can be situations where 90% of the people are of one mind on a particular issue, but the other 10% want to be obstreperous, noisy, or whatever, and waste time, and the 90% aren't that interested. And so the highest motion, so whatever you're talking about, let's say you're talking about a bill, the committee thinks it's not a good bill, inexpedient to legislate, and that's the motion you're discussing, and people are coming up and talking about it. But there's an overriding motion called tabling, which can be made at any moment. So when one side thinks that this has gone on long enough, you could be talking about an issue that there's certain issues that people just want to talk and talk and talk about, so somebody can go up and say, I move to table this bill, right? And so that motion has a higher priority than any other motion dealing with a bill, so you immediately get to vote on that motion, okay? It's not a debatable motion, so you can't start talking forever about tabling motion. So it's a way to break through an inefficient logjam, sort of. And so somebody will make that motion and say, I tabled the bill. And then everybody votes on that motion. And if the bill ends up being tabled, it's put aside, and it can be removed by the body as a whole. Somebody can come up and say, kind of in between bills, you can make sort of other motions. And so in between a bill, you go up there, get recognized, and you say, I move to take House Bill 1234 off the table. And that's another motion you can make at that time, and then that's a 50-50 vote to take it off the table, okay, for a while. After their deadlines in the legislative calendar, because there's a certain time, the clock is running on legislation, and so there's a certain date by which all House bills have to go to the Senate, and all Senate bills have to go to the House. So anything on the table, let's say in the House, that has not yet gone to the Senate, and that day goes by, it's still on the table, but now you're going to need a 2/3 vote to take it off the table. Because a 2/3 vote is what's needed to suspend the rules to do something unusual, like consider a House bill that needs to get to the Senate, right, out of the schedule. So generally speaking, there's rules, and everybody agrees to those rules at the head of time by a regular majority vote. But to break the rules and do something unusual, that's generally a 2/3 kind of a vote. And so it can be, again, the body can do whatever it wants. And I have a little funny story about that. So everybody's seat has a button, has 3 buttons. A white button to say I'm here, and a red button to say I vote no, and a green button to say I vote yes, okay? That's by everybody's seat. I knew a legislator from my first term who had been in the legislature in 1971, then been out for 30-something years, and then came back, okay? He was a great guy. Anyways, he was in the year before they had the buttons, okay? So in the old days, they just did everything by voice vote and by hands, by standing up and sitting down, okay? They didn't have buttons. And so he was part of the legislature that voted on to buy the buttons. All right, and it sped up the process considerably, obviously, having a computer involved. So he was telling me that in the old days, before they had the buttons, sessions took forever. There's still 400 people there. You want to count 400 people. What they did for divisions was, it's called a division because the seats are in 5 divisions, or in 5 groups. So what they did was, they counted Division 1, which is Section 1 of the seats, by having, okay, everybody who votes yes, stand up. And the staff would go around, count heads, right? And then, okay, everybody said yes, sit down, everybody no, stand up. All right, then go count. And the reason they did that by division was they only had enough staff. They couldn't count the whole room at once, so they had to count Division 1, then Division 2, Division 3, like that, right? And so it took, you know, a good 10 minutes. Okay, we're running out of time here. So it took some amount of time to do that. And obviously roll call is they read everybody's name, and then you say yay or nay. So that takes a half an hour or more. So what he told me was, so sessions used to go way past midnight, right? Go 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And so finally, he was in one session, they had a big calendar, they were there at 2 o'clock in the morning, and people are leaving, right? Because they're getting tired. And so there was maybe 180 people or something left in the room, which is less than a quorum. So finally, some bleary-eyed legislator gets up and he says, "Mr. Speaker, is there a quorum here?" You know? And so the speaker says, yes, he rules that there was a quorum, even though clearly there wasn't, right? And so, because he wanted to finish the calendar. And so the guy who wants to go home says, "I challenge the chair." So this is like the ultimate thing to do, is the speaker has made a ruling and you don't like that ruling. Well, what happens? You vote on it, right? So that's a 50-50 vote, just like everything else, right? So he challenges the chair, they had a vote, and the chair was ruled correct, okay, like 100 to 80. So they had a quorum because the body voted, but it was 100 to 80, right? So anyway, so that was a funny story. All right, any other questions? I guess we're out of time. All right, thank you all for coming.